Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kevin Pollack with Emerging Revolutionary War. I'm coming to you live from Morgan's Grove Park, just outside of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, to a site that plays a large role in events that took place during the American Revolution 250 years ago today on July 17th, 1775. So to tell the story of what becomes known as the BeeLine March, which began from this site 250 years ago this afternoon, we have to go back a few months to April 19th, 1775. Of course, if you followed our blog and Facebook page before then, you've seen a lot of our videos covering the events of April 19th, 1775 at the battles of Lexington and Concord. The news that traveled from Boston took days, and in some cases weeks, to get across the American colonies to other locations, including right here to what is now Shepherdstown in Jefferson County in West Virginia, but what was at the time of the American Revolution the community of Mecklenburg that was part of Berkeley County that was then part of Virginia as well. And so it took several weeks until May 10th, actually, 1775, when news reached Mecklenburg of the events that had taken place outside of Boston on April 19th, 1775. That news, coupled with news here in the colony of Virginia that Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, had taken the powder incident, the powder alarm, in Williamsburg in April of 1775 as well. That news, coupled with the news from Boston, really put people on a war footing here in Mecklenburg itself. And the citizens of Mecklenburg began to drill behind the old Entler Hotel, which is now in what is downtown Shepherdstown today, or at least the site of it is, the open lot there. But as more and more men began to drill regularly to, again, prepare themselves for going on a war footing, on June 10th, 1775, they came here to what's now Morgan's Grove Park. It was the home of Colonel William Morgan at the time, for a very large barbecue to celebrate the work that they had done to raise these companies for men to get ready to potentially go off to war if, in fact, they were called to do that. And during these festivities, which featured, again, a large barbecue, patriotic songs were sung, music was played as well during that time. The men promised that 50 years to that day, so in June of 1825, those who were still alive would come back here and commemorate the role that they played in 1775 and in the events of 1775 itself. Now, just a few days after that, in fact, 4 days after the barbecue was held here, so that would be June 14th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress officially established the Continental Army, and as part of that, they raised a quota, or called for a quota of 10 companies of riflemen, 6 from the colony of Pennsylvania, 2 from the colony of Maryland, and 2 from the colony of Virginia, to be raised and then march off to Boston and join the Continental Army that was being formed there, of course, soon enough under George Washington's command, there outside of Boston itself. And so the 2 companies that were raised in Virginia were placed under the command of 2 captains, one who would become famous in American Revolutionary lore. That would be Daniel Morgan, whose company was raised out of Winchester, and then the company that would be raised here out of Mecklenburg was placed under the command of Captain Hugh Stevenson, who did have some military experience from having served in Lord Dunmore's war previous to 1775. The company was raised here in Mecklenburg itself. It took about a week for the complement of 100 soldiers to be raised. They were all men of what was described as of the finest character. The soldiers had to provide their own hunting shirts, their own powder horns, cartridge boxes, canteens, and in some cases clothing as well. Both Morgan's and Stevenson's companies were raised pretty quickly. They received the complement of about 100 men in just about 1 week. However, they weren't able to march immediately because they had to wait for the rifles to arrive. Now, Hugh Stevenson actually outranked Daniel Morgan, and Stevenson and Morgan had agreed that once both companies were ready to be formed, they would rendezvous in Frederick, Maryland, and then march together from there all the way up to Boston itself. It wasn't until mid-July when both companies were ready, and on July 15th, Daniel Morgan's company, without notifying Stevenson's company, began crossing the Potomac and making their way up to Boston. On July 17, 1775, Stevenson's company would depart here from Morgan's Grove in the spring here at Morgan's Grove, make their way across the Potomac River, and then ultimately on to Frederick over the next couple of days. Of course, when they arrived at Frederick, Morgan's men had already passed through, and so Stevenson's company spent the next almost 3 weeks trying to catch up to Morgan's command as they made their way to Boston. Though it wasn't called this at the time, this march on the part of Stevenson's company became known as the BeeLine March, because these men were marching, in some cases, 20 or 30 miles a day to get from what is now the eastern panhandle of West Virginia all the way to the American camps outside of Boston. They were able to do that in 24 days, marching over 600 miles during the course of that time through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then ultimately on to Massachusetts itself. Stevenson's company arrived 5 days after Morgan's company had arrived there at Cambridge, but these were the first Virginians, and of course natives of George Washington's native colony, Virginia, that had arrived to join the Continental Army there outside of Boston itself. Washington was very pleased to have seen these men. The Massachusetts militiamen and the New England militia, who had already been gathered outside of Boston, were shocked at the sight of these men. They weren't wearing what we would think is of military clothing. They were wearing hunting frocks instead, with buckskins in their hats, showing that these men were excellent shots, that they could hit a target, a 7-inch diameter target at a distance of about 250 yards while on the move. So these were certainly excellent and expert riflemen that were now joining George Washington's army outside of Boston in the summer of 1775. Washington, as I mentioned, was very, very excited to have seen these soldiers, and it became, the BeeLine March really just showed the resolve and the resilience of colonists and what they were going to do, or what they were capable of in fighting a war against the British Empire here, that started now in 1775. So just came up here to Shepherdstown to check out a few of the sites related to the BeeLine March itself. Here at Morgan's Grove Park, you won't find any buildings still standing from the American Revolution. You'll find one building that dates back to the time before the American Civil War. There are a couple of interpretive signs here talking about the site's importance to the BeeLine March, as well as a marker that was placed here in 1988, sort of a mini monument and marker placed here at the time, commemorating again the events that took place here at Morgan's Grove Park as part of the BeeLine March 250 years ago to this moment. We're going to make one more stop outside of Shepherdstown to commemorate the BeeLine March, so stay tuned to our Facebook channel. We'll be back with you in just a few minutes.